This episode is about a farmer named Alistar. He had a childhood best friend named Magari, and both hold a deep dark secret that they only knew. The villagers perceived them as pure and kind, but their real personalities were wicked and dark. They were always together, trying to find each other's weaknesses. So when Magari was chosen to be the country's saintess, she dragged him down to her grave, but Alistar stumbled upon a sword after being chased by some goblins. To his surprise, the white sword was talking. He was pushed to the corner and pulled it, making him the wielder of the holy sword, which his dark personality corrupted and changed its color to black. With this, Alistar got tied to the capital with Saintess Magari. He only wished that he would find a rich woman there to leech off, but his plans weren't going as smoothly as planned because of Magari. Alistar had a chance to use the holy sword to protect a girl, but his body was only controlled like a puppet by the sword. This ominous magic power drew attention to him, especially the king and his future enemies. This scumbag protagonist would definitely change your beliefs of how a protagonist should be. Watch the video until the end to find out. The tail of the holy sword was said to be wielded by the hero to defeat the demon king. This sword has the power to exterminate all evil in the world. However, it wasn't as though anyone could just use the sword. The only person who could lift this sword is a person with a pure heart. This story is about the hero Alistar, the guy chosen by the sword, and Saintess Magari, the one chosen by the god. It was a bright, sunny morning. Alistar was working on the farm with the other villagers. He excused himself and said he would take a short break because he was feeling a bit dizzy. Magari was rushing outside near the farm when a villager noticed her. Magari said she would like to read a book in this nice weather. The woman nodded and told her to be careful. It is up on a hill where you can see the whole village. Alistar went there to rest. He yawned and sighed while looking at the peaceful sky. He suddenly heard a familiar voice. He walked to the back of the tree and saw a woman sitting on the grass, reading a book. It was Magari. She commented that this place was good since no one came there. Alistar told her not to come there, but Magari mockingly asked why. Alistar gritted his teeth and said people looking for her would find out he was skipping work. Magari chuckled and wondered how the villagers would react when they learned about his awful personality. Alistar asked if it was a threat, but she said it was only a give-and-take maneuver. Magari rolled her eyes and said she would continue to go there as it would be a pain in the butt if people would know about their real personalities. These two who were loved by the people for their pure personalities. Alistar was known to be a light-hearted and kind man, while Magari was famous for being a fashionable and book-loving woman. However, their true nature was the opposite. Alistar had been acting nice because he wanted to marry a rich woman and leech off of her, and Magari also wanted to marry a rich man so she could live an easy and luxurious life. These two were utterly crazy scammers. Magari sighed and closed the book. He asked what she was reading, and she charmingly said it was a book about how to dispose of a childhood friend, a guide to a perfect crime. Alistar gasped and exclaimed that Magari was planning to dispose of him. He was shaking in fear and madness, and thought he should chop her head first before she could. But Magari suddenly noticed an unfamiliar group of people in their village. They wondered why a bunch of armored people suddenly came to their town. Helge Heibner, a royal knight, announced that he came under the order to escort the newly appointed saint, Lady Magari, to the capital. Helge looked around and asked where Lady Magari was. The sinister duo was dumbfounded and speechless by the news. Alistar looked at her disgustingly and said a crazy personality like hers would make it impossible for her to be appointed as a saintess. He suddenly wondered what a saintess was, so she told him she would explain it, since an ape like him wouldn't understand it. She said a saintess is a woman chosen by the oracles who saves people with her tender heart and fights against demons. Alistar held his laugh after hearing tender heart. Magari cursed him and sighed. Alistar asked if she would return to the village, but she straightforwardly said no. Alistar was shocked and said being a saintess would be like achieving her dream of living in the capital and spending money left and right. Magari scoffed and called him stupid. She said a saintess's job, where you are forced to spread your love and affection to those garbage humans. She tucked her hair behind her ears and said she would rather run away now to marry a rich man. Alistar sneaked to her silently and grabbed her wrist tightly. Magari was surprised and asked why he held her arm. He called her Lady Magari and said he would bring her to the knight. He dragged her down the hill while mockingly begging her to save the country with her powers. She couldn't pull her hands off him, so she continued to curse him, calling Alistar a son of a witch. Inside his mind, he was happy as the only person who knew about his personality would disappear. Helge clicked his tongue and asked if Lady Magari was still not coming. The villagers got anxious and said they couldn't find her, making the knight angry. He glared at the old man and said if they were trying to hide the saintess, they were going up against the royal decree. Helge grabbed his sword, making the old man tremble in fear. When they heard a voice rushing towards them, Helge was surprised and asked if she was Lady Magari. She was caught off guard, calmed her witchy face, and said she was Magari. Magari was shaking when Alistar apologized politely and said his friend was overwhelmed to face her duties as a saintess. Helge nodded and asked for his name. He lowered his head and introduced himself as Alistar, Magari's childhood friend. He added that he found her hiding and persuaded her to come there. She looked at him with her puppy eyes, but the two were conversing differently. differently via eye contact. Alistar was chuckling and telling her to try to get out of this now, while Magary's eyes were telling him that she would crush every organ he had. Helga thanked Alistar for his help and dropped to his knees to pay respect to the saintess. The knight apologized for the abruptness and said he would escort her to the capital. She didn't know how to respond, or should I say to reject the offer. She flashed her sad face and humbly said a simple villager, lacking in knowledge and grace, doesn't deserve such a title. Alistar almost laughed at her act, making her want to kick his butt. The knight said it was impossible because God chose her and that those people who would not accept her would get executed. Magary was trembling in disbelief after realizing she had no escape now. Helge added that if she was proved to be an impostor and unworthy of the title, she would be immediately executed. She would perish if people would know about her true personality. Helge smiled and said he could already tell she was the real Magary and worthy to be a saintess. She tried to force herself to smile but ended up looking like Sadako. Alistar calmly called her and said he would miss her, but she had to do her best for their country. He flashed his charming smile and whispered, "Good luck acting with her life on the line." She sobbed and whispered her curse to him. Helga apologized for interrupting and said they should hurry back to the capital. Alistar grinned and told the knight to take care of his friend for him. She gritted her teeth in anger and suddenly called his name out loud. She squeezed his hand and begged him to come with her to the capital. Alistar frowned his brows and cursed her inside his head. Magary added that she would feel less lonely if he was there, but she was only finding a way to drag him down with her. He chuckled awkwardly as he felt her nails digging into his skin. Helga agreed and said they shouldn't worry about the monsters in the forest because he would protect them. Magary chuckled devilishly and said the knight allowed him to come. He knew that if he would decline now, he would look bad in front of everyone. He could feel his mouth twitching as he forced himself to smile and said he would come. Magary thanked him humbly, making the knight teary-eyed, saying their friendship was so wonderful. And so, the saintess successfully dragged Alistar along to the capital. When they arrived at the capital, Alistar was mesmerized by the castle's infrastructure. He suddenly wondered if he could find some rich women there to leech off, but the saintess was losing her mind, thinking of a way to drag him down further. Alistar called the knight and said he had to head back now. Magary immediately pulled him closer and said he should go sightseeing since he came all this way, but Alistar calmly said he had work to do. Inside Magary's head, she was cursing him and saying he always skipped his work. He looked at her and told her she shouldn't be selfish and fulfill their duties. He flashed his creepy grin before bidding goodbye to them. Magary was discarded at the capital, making him happy because he could spend all his life not worrying about his dark secret. A few hours later, he was being chased by angry goblins. The tiny monsters growled and wielded their weapons at the human. Alistar shooed them away, telling them not to chase a good-looking guy like him. He screamed while running for hours, and he could feel his legs getting numb. He was at his limit when he tripped on a tree root. He lost his balance and dived into a bush. The tiny goblins stopped because they lost sight of the human. Alistar grunted and cursed the thing that tripped him. He stood up and gasped when he saw the goblins on the other side of the bush. He immediately ducked to hide, but he felt his ankle in pain. Alistar couldn't believe he sprained his ankle, so he dragged his leg while crying his ass off. When he was walking, he noticed something. He went closer to check it, and there he was, a sword struck on the ground. He noticed that there was a different holy and pure aura in this particular area. The holy aura made him sick and tremble. He was curious about the sword and remembered it was almost the same as a story out of a book Magary was reading. He remembered Magary saying the hero who pulled the holy sword was too kind, making her want to puke. He scoffed and said pulling the sword to become a hero was stupid, but to his shock, he heard someone say he should pull it. He turned around but saw nothing. He heard the voice, but it was coming from the sword. Alistar went silent for a moment. His voice was shaking in disbelief, and he asked if the sword was the one talking. When the sword said yes, Alistar got scared and thought the sword was a monster. He was about to run, but the sword stopped him. Alistar ignored him, but he grunted whenever his ankle ached. The sword noticed it and said he would fix his injury for him. He had a sour face, and he thought it was fishy, but he ended up walking closer to the sword. He tried to trust the weird sword, but it suddenly wiggled left and right, and said it had been a long time since he was able to talk to someone. He asked the human how the world was doing, but Alistar bluntly said he didn't know since he grew up in the sticks. He wanted to kick the sword and make it heal his ankle, but it suddenly asked why he found him. When Alistar explained goblins were chasing him, the sword gasped and said he should pull and use him as a weapon. Alistar waved his hand and said it would be impossible because he didn't know how to use a sword. The sword shined and told him not to worry because he would control his body and fight for him, making Alistar think the sword would curse him to control his body. So he refused. He jumped when the goblin growled at him. The sword sighed and mockingly said he had no choice now. Alistar cursed the sword as he realized the sword suggested it, knowing his position, and aimed to set him up from the start. Alistar called the sword a cursed one, but the sword called him rude and said he was a holy sword. The goblin rushed to him. They were getting closer, making him think if he should get crushed by the goblins or be cursed by the sword. He cried and cursed as he pulled the sword out of the ground. He pulled harder, but he couldn't pull it out. Alistar screamed at the sword and told him to get out of the ground. The sword calmed him down and asked for his name first. He said his name was Alistar, and the sword told him his name. Simultaneously, the sword suddenly became lighter. The magic power from the sword emerged and surrounded him. On the other hand, Magary Magari was in the castle, sitting on a chair next to a window. She was hiding her witchy attitude. She was angry as she got trapped there, while that ape got to live a carefree life. Her thoughts were interrupted when she thought of something. She called Helge and asked if she could go after her friend to ensure his safety on his way home. The knight said he would send some knight to escort her friend, but she insisted on allowing her to go as well. Helge tried to say no to the saintess, but when she flashed her teary puppy eyes, he surrendered and allowed her. Magari grinned and chuckled devilishly. Back in the forest, Alistar was able to pull the sword out easily, but the blinding light was distracting him. The sword was making weird noises, it was shaking, and suddenly, it screamed like it was being torn apart. Alistar yelled and told the sword to shut his damn mouth. The holy sword was stuttering. A dark aura suddenly came out from the handle, corrupting him. Alistar was dumbfounded and said he couldn't understand what the holy sword was saying. He was disgusted when he noticed the pure blade became black and thought it wasn't his fault. The sword exclaimed angrily that it was his fault. Alistar got confused and asked if he said his thoughts aloud, but the holy sword said he could hear his thoughts because they were contracted. He froze and thought another person found out about his dark personality and thought of discarding the sword. The sword shrieked in fear while covering his ears and told Alistar to shut it. The sword was quivering and panting while saying it felt like a stranger was ravaging his insides. Alistar grunted and told him he was being gross. Alistar got pissed when the holy sword called him a monster for containing much evil. He cursed the holy sword and started thinking about bad things. The blade turned totally black. Alistar couldn't believe the sword could look gross like this. He flinched when the goblins were a few meters away from him, so he told the holy sword to show off his power. The sword huffed and said no. Alistar said it wasn't what they agreed to, but the holy sword got pissed off because he made him turn black. The goblins were confused to see the weird human arguing with a sword. The holy sword said he would be fine if Alistar would perish, since monsters couldn't use him. Alistar suddenly realized that a holy sword shouldn't be looking like this. The sword mumbled that he would remain as the holy sword, but Alistar asked if he could still use his power. The sword was fuming mad and told him not to look down on him. The sword moved and pointed towards the goblins, but nothing happened. They could only feel the cold wind from the forest at this point. The holy sword couldn't believe his power was gone. Alistar calls him a stupid scrap metal. The sword pointed at him and said it was all his fault for corrupting him. The two continued arguing for seconds, making the goblins speechless. The holy sword explained that he could instantly feel the power surge whenever his contractor called his name. Alistar asked if his name wasn't enough. He stared at the holy sword and thought the nasty shade of black could make one's skin crawl. He lifted the sword into the air, ordered it to unleash his power, and called it a demon sword. The sword screamed in shock and told him to shut his mouth. The sword got mad for his rudeness and said his name was a holy sword. To their shock, a dark magic power suddenly emerged from the sword and blasted into the sky. The saintess and the knight saw the explosion of magic power. Magari could feel the familiar baleful and wicked man that reminded her of someone. The saintess told Helge to follow that manna, as she could feel her dear childhood friend was there. The demon sword was trembling in anger. He couldn't believe his holiness was gone. Alistar told the sword to just get rid of the monsters, so the demon sword sighed and said he would release his anger on these goblins, instead of bringing him a monkey contractor. Alistar's eyes widened when the sword started moving on its own, as did his body. He asked the demon sword how he could control his body when it launched an attack. The black magic mana exploded after the impact. When the smoke faded, the trees were gone, and the ground had a hole in it. The demon sword giggled and told him to hold his praises, as this was their first step towards saving many people in need. Alistar frowned his brows and asked why he had to go around and act like a hero. The demon sword got confused and said it was normal to help others in need, since that would be his fate as a hero and a holy sword wielder. Alistar scoffed and said he would rather marry a rich old woman than become a hero, because it was easier. He released the sword, but the sword grabbed onto his arm. The sword started whining and begged him not to leave him. The sword asked if he was just a game to him, making Alistar feel gross. He told the sword not to say it that way, as it made him feel sick. Alistar couldn't take the whining sword, so he used it to dig the ground to bury it, but he suddenly heard some noises inside the woods. He turned around and saw the witch and the knight. Sweat started dripping from his face after seeing the nightmare of his life. Magari grinned and said she was glad to see him safe. I could definitely tell these two were made for each other, but I fear what their children will be like. After Alistar pulled that sword out and got reunited with his childhood friend, they went back to the castle. They were having a conversation on a cup of tea. Magari expressed her happiness that she could spend more time with him, but Alistar couldn't utter another word because he was promptly dragged back to the capital. The demon sword suddenly commented that his childhood friend was cute. Alistar glared at the demon sword and said this woman knows the real him. They talked using telepathy so no one would hear them. The sword gasped and said she was too nice to accept his nasty personality. Alistar cursed him and said Magari was only pretending to be kind and that she was way worse than his raw sewage personality. The sword was surprised, as he couldn't believe there was someone worse than him. Helge apologized to Alistar for bringing him back forcibly. He explained that he brought him there because of the holy sword he got from the forest. He scoffed and thought this metal scrap was suited to be called a demon sword for its color. Helge said the wielder of the holy sword had the traits of a hero. The sword was said to contain so much holy power that their kingdom had been looking in the forest for ages arrows but wasn't successful. Alistar sighed and thought those soldiers must have potatoes for eyes when he found it just by running around. Helge added that if that was the real holy sword, he had to report it to the king and ask him to stay in the capital until further instruction. Magari called him happily and said she was glad she wouldn't be lonely in the capital now. Alistar could feel his soul leaving his body. His body would deteriorate if he took any more minutes with the twisted woman. He suddenly said he didn't think it was the holy sword and pointed to the pitch black color. He said it was more like a demon sword and suggested destroying it immediately and disposing of it. Helge looked at it and thought he had a point, since he expected a holy sword to look pure. The sword cursed Alistar and said it was his fault for making him look like this. Alistar suddenly thought the blade did turn black the second he touched it. He told the sword he was reading too much into it, so the sword called him scummy. Alistar stood up abruptly and said their village was already struggling, and he asked the knight to allow him to return to his village and help them. Magari couldn't believe he could come up with such a lie, but the gullible Helge seemed to have bought it. The knight sighed and said there was still a chance that it was a holy sword, so he couldn't let him go until it was confirmed. Magari giggled at him to piss him more. He was about to cry for his act, but Helge told him they provided him with high-class lodging and the best food during his stay. After hearing the offer, Alistar immediately took a 180 turn and accepted it. He took a deep breath and thought he had the country's precious sword. Magari suddenly squeezed his hands and said he should take care of her also from now on. The sword didn't believe this saintess was a monster like Alistar, but the moment she showed her evil side, the holy sword was dumbfounded. Helge excused himself and told the saintess that they should head back now. Magari was shocked and asked if she wouldn't be staying with Alistar, but the knight pointed out the highest point of the castle, where she would have to stay under the royal decree. Alistar smiled and said good luck, but his eyes were telling her to have fun acting like a saint when she's a witch. Alistar was moved to the most expensive inn and was greeted by a maid. He greeted the maid back and closed the bedroom door. He turned to check out the place, and everything was sparkling and screaming with elegance. He sat on a chair comfortably and started laughing like an idiot. He said a chair like this fits a handsome man like him, but the sword called him a pinnacle of scum. He shut the sword and said he made the right choice to follow them back here. The sword cleared his voice and said he would like to say something since they would be together for a long time. Alistar looked at the sword when he heard they would be together for a long time. He grabbed it and was about to throw it outside the window, but the sword told him he wouldn't break and would return immediately no matter what he did. The sword said that even if he threw him under a cliff, he would return to him instantly. Alistar whined and asked if he was some kind of a clingy woman. He cleared out that he didn't want to be a hero and was dedicated to marrying a rich woman instead. The sword sighed and said he could not run away from destiny. Alistar wagged the sword and said he wouldn't stay with a magnet of misfortune like him and get back to his village. He tossed the sword to the side when it said Alistar would have to fight for justice with him as a hero. He walked to the mirror, seducing himself. He touched the mirror and told himself he was beautiful all day. He smiled and was about to kiss his reflection when he noticed his reflection became ugly. He screamed as he couldn't believe it. The sword chuckled and said the next time he did something against his will, he would make him uglier and perish with that face. He opened the window and was about to throw the sword. He turned Alistar's face back to normal and told him nothing would happen as long as he didn't refuse to do good deeds. He exclaimed that he couldn't be a hero because he had low stamina and muscles from skipping his work. The sword calmed him, and he said not to worry about it because he had many experiences of the generations of heroes before him. Alistar suddenly remembered the moment he used the power of the sword. He wondered if doing those stunts would be okay for an untrained body like his, but the sword did not reply. The sword got nervous, said he wouldn't perish, and whispered, probably. Alistar cursed him and asked what that pause there was. He wiped his tears, said he only wanted to live a normal life, and started whining like a kid who lost his pacifier. He closed the window, but the sword said he heard a woman's voice. Alistar ignored him and said the bed was so soft that he wanted to sleep and not be disturbed. The sword kept saying that he heard a woman's voice, but Alistar continued saying he did not hear anything. The sword pulled his blanket and told him they should check the woman to see if she was safe. Alistar suddenly felt his nose getting big, so he screamed and told him to stop tarnishing his beautiful face. Alistar had no choice but to carry out justice. They went out and walked around the streets of the capital. Alistar wagged the sword and said all sorts of people gathered in this place. He added that some even sell their children off to become slaves, kidnappers, or any human trafficking business. The sword praised him for being knowledgeable, despite living in a small village. He said Magari taught him those, and proposed to return to their place since it was dangerous. The sword suddenly heard the voice and started dragging Alistar towards it. He was cursing the sword for startling him. He was shocked to see a huge peach, a girl, standing under the moonlight. The two observed her and wondered what she was doing. The girl lifted her hand to the sky and sorrowfully asked why her love left her alone. Those grieving eyes glanced at the moon. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes. Alistar was dumbfounded. He cursed inside his head and wondered if the girl had a loose screw inside her head. She kept talking poetically alone, making him wonder if she was on drugs and high as fog. He told the demon sword that they should leave, but the sword told him they should wait a bit longer. He wagged the sword and cursed the sword for being stupid because he was the one looking suspicious because he was staring at a girl while holding a sword. He froze when the girl asked who was there. Alistar almost farted in shock shock and thought they were caught. Alistar got nervous and thought this girl would definitely think of him as a serial killer. He went out and said he only heard her voice from the inn where he was staying. He added that he only checked on her to see if she was alright, but the sword commented he was about to go home just a while ago. The girl apologized for causing him to worry, and he thought she didn't seem like a heavy user. He scanned her and thought she looked nice but was obviously broke. The girl suddenly said she was only practicing for a play. Alistar nodded and said it was amazing. He said he would leave now, but the sword said it was too sudden to leave. He pierced the sword on the ground and said he didn't care about her acting. He glared at him and said he had been acting his whole life and wouldn't go lumping with something so amateur as theatrics. He looked back at her and waved goodbye, but the girl grabbed him to stop him. The girl asked him to stay, and he could feel her squeezing tight. He was left with no choice but to sit beside her and listen. She said he had been practicing alone, and she needed an audience to practice. She looked at him and asked if he could help her practice. Alistar asked why him, but she shyly said he was there already. He asked when she would practice, but she said right now, during the night, since the day was too crowded. Alistar chuckled awkwardly and thought staying out late with a woman in this crime-infested capital was a big no. He was about to reject her when he suddenly couldn't open his mouth. Alistar heard the sword saying he shouldn't leave the girl alone every night, but he cursed him. By looking at the girl, it was only a matter of time before some thugs went up to her, and that's why the holy sword wanted Alistar to protect her. Alistar sighed in defeat and said he would help her. She reached out her hands and said her name was Silk. He reached her hand and introduced himself. Silk smiled as they shook their hands, but behind Alistar's mind, he was wondering if she would get murdered before he got there tomorrow. The next day seemed pretty interesting. The king was sitting on his throne and watched the newly appointed Saintess Magari walk towards him. The knight greeted the king by kneeling and bowing his head, so she did a curtsy. Helge introduced Lady Magari to the king. The king praised his good work and told her to raise her head. The king greeted the saintess and properly introduced himself. Magari forced a smile and said she was honored to be in his presence. She was getting nervous as she faced the top dog of the country. She had to perform her best, and the king seemed to buy it also. The king said her appearance and personality were worthy of the title of saintess. Magari was so anxious because the king saw through her actions and got executed. The king said it was a sudden prophecy, and they had to see if she was the saintess foretold by the oracle. Knight Helga called the saintess and showed her the magical ring inside the box. She took it and examined it. The king ordered her to put the ring on her finger, making her shiver in fear. Everyone was staring at her, and she didn't know what would happen. She started sweating and thought she would get executed if she failed this. She bit her tongue as she slowly shoved the ring to her ring finger. She screamed when a light came out of the ring. The purity of the magical light blinded the people there. The king had confirmed that Magari was the saintess the prophecy was saying. She had been staring at the light in shock. She suddenly felt a burning sensation in her eyes. The ring didn't get corrupted, but at least the holy light corrupted her sinful eyes, which was a window to the soul. The king was delighted and praised the saintess. He ordered Magari to undergo her training to become a fully pledged saintess. Magari was dumbfounded, and she couldn't accept that she would live her life helping garbage people. The voice of a young man was yelling at his father. The first prince, named Iria, came rushing in, asking his father what he was doing. Magari watched them argue. Iria said the kingdom doesn't need a saintess, and that they shouldn't believe in superstitious prophecies. Magari was shocked to know the prince was an anti-saintess, and this could be her chance. She cheered him inside her head as Iria said their country would fall apart after appointing a commoner who knew nothing about being a saint. The king asked his son if he was aware that the saintess was right next to him. Iria was shocked and turned to call her a whore. He asked if she planned to take over their country when he noticed her charming face, and behind that face she was already roasting the hell out of the prince and thought she had been protecting her virginity for her future husband. Iria was speechless and stared at her. Magari kept her face innocent, making the prince's heart throbbed. Iria thought the woman looked beautiful and instantly captivated his heart. That same day at night, Silk was practicing her acting skills while Alistar read the lines in a monotone. He couldn't believe he would be forced to do such a humiliating thing. He suddenly heard the sword sniffing, touched by the story. Alistar continued saying what the script says. Silk moved closer, rested her head on his chest, and said he should leave his proof of love within him. He was about to say the next line, but the cheesy line and the unnecessary pressing of those soft things onto him grossed him out. He could feel he was gonna puke any moment now. Silk pressed her melons onto him and looked at him with captivating eyes. She reached his lips, making Alistar nervous and fearful. But luckily, Silk pulled out and said it was the end of the story. She thanked Alistar for his help. The sword commented that her acting skills had improved and that her acting skills moved him. Silk took out the food she had prepared, but our overly cautious protagonist wanted to reject it. The sword warned him, and he ended up munching the food. He was surprised that it tasted good. Silk reached his face to take off some crumbs and ate it. Alistar chuckled awkwardly and thought it was either gross or a part of her acting. Silk said that she had fun with the time they spent together, and added that she never thought she would feel this enjoyment again. Alistar got nervous, thinking she might confess her feelings to him, so he munched the food quickly to get out of there. She looked at him and said she was a slave who used to be a nobility. Alistar was stunned and thought it was much worse than what he expected. This is a proof that our protagonist ain't a simp. Alistar couldn't believe this girl would be talking about a topic this heavy like her melons. hands. She gazed at him and asked if he was surprised, but he was indeed shocked by her insensitiveness. The sword scolded him and told him to listen to her story, but Alistar glared at the sword and said he didn't care about her ruined family of nobles. Silk continued talking and said her family, the Hellhen family, got along well together. Her dad believed nobles should work for their people and always think of others before himself. Alistar scoffed and thought if he would become a noble, he would abuse it left and right. She sighed and said Primo Zaratni was the one who oppressed people with his power. Primo was constantly compared to his dad by Primo's people and grew to despise their family. Their family was convicted of a false crime and was executed by this person. The sword clicked a sound and said there were also awful people like Alistar among nobles. When their parents were gone, the Hellhen house was ruined and Silk was sold as a slave. The one who bought her as a slave was the same person who destroyed her family. Silk suddenly apologized for bringing something like that up, but Alistar had been wanting to put some duct tape on that mouth of hers as her problems were running inside his head now. The sword told him to save Silk, but Alistar said it would be impossible since slavery was legal and their opponent was a noble. He suddenly thought they could dig up and find proof that Primo killed Silk's parents so he would get arrested, and then Silk would be available as a slave. Silk said she had a dream of becoming a member of a royal theater troupe since she was little. She smiled softly and said she knew it would be impossible for now, but she believed she could achieve it someday. Alistar asked if he finds it hard to work in the day and practice at night, but Silk humbly said no. He sighed and said he understood that feeling, which surprised the sword. Alistar had worked hard, as he claimed, for the sake of his dream of leeching off a rich woman. He frowned and thought he would execute everyone if he didn't achieve it. Silk said she badly wanted to take the entrance test of the theater troupe, but she had no guts to ask Primo about it. Alistar asked if the test would happen at night, and Silk said yes. He looked at her and told her to secretly take it to make her dreams come true. After all, it was her life. His face shined on Silk's eyes. She was speechless by the comforting aura Alistar was giving. He told her she should be able to sneak out just like now without getting caught. The sword giggled and thought Alistar did have soft spots. But those thoughts didn't last because Alistar hoped she would get caught, so he wouldn't be coming to these practices anymore. Silk nodded and said she would do her best. The sword started rumbling and trembling in anger. He told Alistar he would do various things to fulfill Silk's dream. From that day on, Alistar was busy with his mission to help Silk. He did it as he thought that if she succeeded, Silk might introduce him to the rich girl of his dreams. The sword tugged his clothes and asked if he felt good after helping someone. He ignored the sword, but a knock on the door was heard. Magari came in through the door, and instantly, Alistar told her to go back to her cage. Magari slammed the door and exclaimed angrily that she had gone out of her way to visit him. He grunted and said that just seeing her face made him feel depressed. She chuckled, saying seeing him depressed makes her heart flutter. When she sat, Alistar asked why she crawled to his room. She stared blankly at the wall and said she could feel her face getting numb after smiling and acting innocent around the clock. She had nowhere to go to be herself because she could get executed instantly. Alistar was speechless and wondered if she was really crying, and there she was, indeed drained and crying. Alistar smiled brightly and said her situation made his day happy. So she cursed him and told him to perish most pitifully. He asked if she had found a rich guy from his dream, and she suddenly thought of Iria. He slammed her face on the table and said the prince was the worst. Alistar called her and asked to lend him some money, which Magari immediately rejected. Alistar slammed his fist, ordered her to loan him money, and said he would repay it. But Magari declined and said that was what somebody who won't pay back would say. He said he never broke a promise, but she knew this scum always broke promises. She scolded and asked him where he would use the money. Alistar coughed and said he would save someone. She felt a shiver run through her spine. She asked if he was alright and if he hit his head with something. He asks to borrow the money she receives for being a saintess and swears to pay it back. He cursed and even lowered his head to Magari to convince her. She suddenly thought Alistar should fulfill his duty so that he would be trapped inside the capital with her forever. So she gave him her spare money, but told him that the interest rate was 10% daily. The sun went down and Silk had been waiting for Alistar. She wondered why he wasn't coming, but to her surprise, he appeared. He apologized for the delay, but she said she had just arrived. She noticed a box he was holding. Alistar smiled and gave her the box. She opened it, and it was a beautiful dress that suited her complexion. She was flustered and asked why he gave her such an expensive dress. Alistar said she should use it as the first step towards her dream, the audition. But at the back of his head, he regretted buying that dress. The sword sighed and asked if he could repay the money he borrowed from Magari. He raised his eyebrows and said he did not plan to pay it back from the start. Silk embraced the dress tightly and thanked Alistar from the bottom of her heart. He smiled in response, and she excused herself to put it on quickly. He sighed and wished something would fall on her head and lose consciousness. When she was done, she went out and showed it to Alistar. The dress fits her slim body perfectly. Silk had been through a lot of pain and sadness, but she thought that ever since she met Alistar, he had been like a light, illuminating her dark life, almost making Alistar puke. Silk thought he was weird because of his gross-looking black sword, but to her surprise, Alistar helped and cheered her every night. She smiled and said he was kind and a wonderful person. To their shock, a creepy voice spoke, saying Silk seemed too happy. She turned around and was surprised to see her master Primo, looking like a product of an incest couple. Silk trembled and asked why he was there. Primo frowned at that question and said he was only searching for his slave, who had been slipping out night after night. The creepy woman beside him started giggling, and her name was Edwiju. The crazy woman gazed at Silk and said yes. Silk started sweating cold when Primo asked where she got that dress. Silk was stunned and didn't want to drag Alistar to her mess. Primo ordered Edwiju to grab Silk. She ran and grabbed Silk on her neck. Edwiju tightened her grip and pressed her nails onto her neck. Primo sighed and told the crazy slut not to go overboard. Edwiju felt shivered when Silk started begging and saying her dress was getting dirty. The slut cringed and said her cute face and pure white dress were way too irritating for her. She grinned and said she would love to see her face and that dress crushed to bits. Silk tried to push Edwiju's arm away, but she was too strong. Silk suddenly wondered why her life had gotten this worse. She only wanted to be an actor. Tears continued to fall as he let go of Edwiju's hand. She was losing hope and asked if it was wrong to dream. Alistar decided to move closer and told her it was alright to dream. The dark magic mana from the sword burst and struck Edwiju's abdomen. She looked up and was surprised to see Alistar bravely facing them. The slut cursed the Alistar. I bet it started smelling a little fishy there. Alistar smirked and exclaimed he would protect the future superstar, but his inner voice was screaming in pain as he didn't want to fight the disgusting slut and the cursed Santa Claus Primo. He glared at her and pointed his sword at Edwiju. Silk was still speechless and couldn't believe someone was fighting for her. Edwiju tilted her head as he couldn't believe this young man wanted to save a slave. She stood up and started tying her hair up. She called him stupid for choosing the slave's side. Alistar called the demon's sword inside his head in the middle of their conversation and asked if they should return to their lodging now, but the sword told him it was impossible after he said those lines. Alistar gazed at the crazy woman and thought she was clearly a dangerous woman, and her laugh scared him because it sounded like a person dying of asthma. They continued to argue inside his head, but Primo suddenly asked if he was the man from the reports. He scoffed and said the young man had been taking good care of his slave. Alistar hid his crumpled face and angrily cursed Silk for exposing his identity to this ugly man. Primo added that he even hit his guard, Edwiju, who was a member of a grey guild called Akantera. He continued to blabber, but Alistar couldn't understand, so the sword said grey guilds are criminal organizations where murderers could easily join. Alistar took a step back after learning that, but Silk called his name. She told him to run away and leave her there with tears in her eyes. Alistar thought it would be an excellent idea, but the sword scolded and told him to help Silk. Alistar knew he couldn't run away now, so he thought of something to motivate him. He stood confidently and told Silk he would take these guys down, but the truth is, he would only help her because he didn't want the dress he bought torn to shreds. He smiled like a cockroach and told her not to worry and watch him. The sword sighed because Alistar was saying the complete opposite of his thoughts. Edwiju was blushing and thought the young man was cool for not being frightened after hearing Akantera. The porkhead Primo ordered Edwiju to attack, so she shifted her body and ran towards Alistar. Alistar was shocked because she had already reached behind him. She landed on the floor after flipping, and the sword knew this woman would be aiming for Alistar's legs, so he moved and blocked her attack. Edwiju was taken aback and commended him for blocking it. She stood up and asked what guild he was in, but Alistar said he was just a farmer. His body was shaking because he felt his back crack with that rapid turn. Edwiju was dumbfounded and said he didn't look and feel like a farmer. She pointed out the black sword and said it had a sinister feel, making the sword feel insulted. Well, he was supposed to be a holy sword. Alistar smirked and said it was actually the cursed sword. Primo choked on his saliva and asked if it was the one who had said to bestow a great power that brings its owner great riches, confusing Alistar. Edwiju was amazed and said there was no way he was an ordinary farmer. Stop it, guys. You're making his head bigger. Edwiju started giggling like she was about to perish from asthma. She lifted her soft gaze and said she had taken a liking to him, which sent a shiver down his spine. The sword chuckled and mockingly said he had a wife candidate now. Edwiju asked him to live with her. She added that she would take his hands and feet off and play with him like a doll that couldn't move. Imagine getting your hands and feet cut off by that gimp woman, getting turned into a marionette puppet. Primo scolded Edwiju, telling her to end it quickly and get the sword. Edwiju's smile faded and turned into a grim one. She glared at him and said nothing would stop her from doing what she wanted. Primo gulped and had no choice but to let her be. Edwiju blew him a kiss and thanked him, making Alistar's stomach rumble. Alistar flinched when she turned to him and told him to be a good boy and let her slice his extremities. Alistar started sweating as Edwiju dashed towards him. They noticed the crazy woman's speed doubled, but luckily, the sword managed to move Alistar's body to block her. His inner voice was cursing the sword, telling him not to force his body to move. Edwiju flipped to evade his sword. Mid-air, she chuckled and said he was about as strong as her guildmaster. Alistar was shocked to know there was a monster even worse than this crazy woman. She distanced herself and breathed deeply. She sighed and said she would get a bit serious now. She leaped with a creepy grin, but Alistar couldn't follow her fast movements. He was dumbfounded. The sword tried to warn him, but he dodged it a little late. The blade sliced the flash on his shoulder, and he could feel the burning sensation from the wound. Edwiju looked behind and thought she had taken an arm, but it was just a scratch. Alistar sighed and asked if that was it, but his inner voice was screaming in pain. Silk worriedly called him, so he told her it was only a graze. boys, but was crying inside from the blood he lost. He gritted his teeth and wondered if it would leave a scar on his beautiful skin, but the sword told him to get used to it now. Alistar said it was the sword's fault, but the sword got serious and told him it was his fault. The sword said it was his fault for being weak, as Alistar's body couldn't keep up with where he told it to go. The sword sighed and told him he would show him what happens when he gets serious. The sword moved his body, making Edwiju grin and say, "Hurry up and surrender now, young man." She charged towards him, saying she could end his life accidentally if she got carried away. The sword told Alistar he could use his weak body to become strong. Midway, Edwiju disappeared again from his sight. To her shock, the man suddenly moved and swung his arms backward. The sword said he had gotten used to it. She felt the handle of the sword strike his abdomen. She grunted and leaped backward. She held her abdomen and glared at him. Edwiju asked how he was able to see her. Alistar smirked and said he had gotten used to it, stealing the sword's line. Edwiju chuckled in disbelief. She walked slowly to the man. She couldn't accept that someone could see through her moves. She screamed and attacked Alistar at such speed. Her shadows multiplied due to her speed, making Alistar whine like a kid at the sword. The sword calmed him, telling him it was just an illusion, and using his senses to perceive her. He had no choice but to follow the sword, so he swung his sword on the spot. He felt her presence and was able to slash her real body. The woman gasped and fell off the floor, bathing in her blood. Silk held her thumping chest, while Primo was in disbelief that an Akantara member was taken out easily. The sword scoffed and told Alistar it was easy, but even he was still in shock by what had happened. When they wrapped things up, he went back to the inn and started screaming like he lost his sanity. The sword laughed and said he might be feeling good after doing good things. Alistar pointed at the sword and said the Grey Guild would chase him now because of what the sword did. The sword suddenly remembered what had happened after he defeated Edwiju. Primo couldn't believe this young man beat his bodyguard. Alistar scoffed and threatened that he would be his next target if he wouldn't release Silk from slavery. Primo felt creeps from his gaze. Sweat started dripping from his face. He pointed at him and said owning Silk as his slave was his legal right, and that a commoner like him shouldn't get cocky with him. Alistar sighed and decided to use the last trick he had. He threw the papers he had been working on for the past few days. Silk and Primo grabbed a piece of paper and were shocked. It was proof that Primo planned to assassinate Silk's parents and unfairly move her into a slave. Alistar smirked and mockingly wondered what would happen to his pig face when he handed it over to the knights. The sword praised him for his hard work, but Alistar was only pushed to gather proof because he kept bugging him. Primo grunted and kept silent, but started trembling when he saw the young man's mischievous grin. Alistar was laughing devilishly at the pigsty's scared face. Primo grunted and said this wouldn't end neatly for him because he had a connection to a Grey Guild. He added that he would soon meet his end. Alistar stared at him and called the sword. His cold sweat started dripping, and he told the sword that Primo seemed like he was reflecting on his mistake and asked to let it slide. When the sword said no, Alistar kicked his knee onto the sword and said the pigsty might send another crazy woman to him. He cursed and said he didn't care anymore about Silk. Primo laughed and asked where his boldness had gone. The sword suddenly went silent. Alistar was surprised when his body started to get controlled by the holy sword. Alistar was screaming at the sword inside his head to stop him, but it was too late. He bonked the sword at Primo and made him lose consciousness. The sword was angry at Primo and all of the Grey Guild and said they should experience a bit of pain to reflect. Alistar was panting for air, still recovering because he felt like all of his muscles were stretching too much. He looked at the scar on his arm and thought it looked gross. The sword commended their hard work for getting Primo in jail and made Silk as free as a bird. The sword flinched when Alistar said Silk might have obtained freedom but didn't have a home to return to. Alistar couldn't believe the sword and didn't think of the consequences of it. Alistar sat and plastered his mischievous grin and said it was all hypocrisy that satisfied him. The sword suggested that Alistar supports Silk, but he said he would rather be supported. He was startled when a knock was heard. A maid said a visitor named Silk had arrived and told them to let her inside his room. At the Royal Theatre, Prince Iria assisted Saintess Magari in getting a seat beside him. Magari grabbed his hand and thanked him. She hid her disgusted face and thought he wanted to go home and sleep. The prince explained that tonight was the Royal Theatre troupe's audition, but she smiled, and her inner voice was screaming she wasn't interested. Iria said he wanted to show her these youths who had overflowing dreams as she was a saintess that must envelop all her love. But as expected, she wasn't interested. She might be thinking of bailing the prince right now. Magari smiled at him. All she knew was that this prince was interested in her. She did want to leech off a rich guy, but didn't expect somebody at the level of a prince. Being a queen was also troublesome, so she didn't want it. Out of nowhere, the prince suddenly said he would treasure his memories with her. Magari started sweating cold and nervous when Prince Iria said he would prefer her to support the country by his side, rather than as the saintess of their country. Iria was blushing and told her to listen carefully. He held her soft hand, making Magari curse inside her head. She could feel her smile shaking as she screamed inside her mind for somebody to save her. A voice suddenly called the prince. She was relieved that Helge told the prince his father had requested for him. Prince Iria apologized and told her they should go somewhere alone, where they couldn't be interrupted next time. He waved and said he would be right back, but she wished for him not to return. When he was gone, she sighed in exhaustion. The next auditionee came in. It was Silk. She was nervous when she introduced herself. Maggie Magari looked at her and thought she was a plain girl. She thought she would be a better actress than this girl. But when she noticed their huge difference, Silk had bigger potential than Magari, right? She sighed and shoved the idea away. Silk looked around finding Alistar, but he was not there. Her face sulked, and she remembered what happened earlier. It was when Silk came to Alistar's room. She thanked him for giving her freedom. Alistar looked awkward when he said he was only doing it as he pleased. Silk knew it would be impossible to revive her house, so she would start by trying to fulfill her dream. She handed the ticket to Alistar and invited him to watch her audition. Alistar was shocked and thought he was just about to sleep. He was saying he would reject it, but felt her face transforming, so he slapped his face and hid it. Silk asked if he was alright, but he said a bug was on his face. The sword ruined his face to make him say yes, as he knew Alistar's weakness was his face. Silk sighed and thought maybe he didn't really want to come. She shook the thought away and believed that he would come. The man on the front row read her application and said she would use the Tales of Elias for her audition. Magari could remember that story. It was a tale where Princess Ramadora was kidnapped by a villain named Gyabari. The hero, Elias, faced the villain to save the princess, who was bound to be his love. Magari sighed and wished that the story had ended in tragedy. When Silk was asked if she would be performing alone, a man came out from the backstage. The man grinned and asked if the boy didn't come along. The man walked closer, calling Silk as Ramadora. He moved closer and whispered, "Nice to meet you, Miss Former Slave." He introduced himself as Albert, the guildmaster of Akantera. After hearing that, Silk started trembling in fear. The examiner asked if they would be taking the exam together. Albert said Silk would be playing Ramadora, and he would be the villain, Gyabari. Silk lowered his gaze and wondered why Albert came there when Primo was in jail. She faced her and asked why she was aiming for her. It was part of her lines, but it was the exact words that she wanted to say. Albert was surprised and decided to play along with her acting. He said he was using her as bait to lure Elias there. Silk's eyes widened when she thought of Alistar. She shivered when she realized Albert's target was Alistar. He came there to take revenge for that crazy woman. Albert chuckled devilishly and said he would trap her until Elias arrived. Silk's heart started pumping fast. Meanwhile, Magari lifted her head and felt the man's familiar aura. Looks like scumbags could really sense another of its kind. On the other side, Alistar was cornered by some bastards. 4 monkeys had gathered around him with weapons. Alistar couldn't understand why this bastard came to him and said it was the sword's fault for making him leave his room to watch Silk. The sword said they promised to go there, but Alistar cursed him because he said yes when he tried to make his face ugly. He bit his lips and said he would snap the sword after this. A man looking like Hanma from Tokyo, a revenger, approached him and asked if he was the guy who had beaten Edoeju. Alistar was still processing what was happening and thought he was referring to that crazy woman. He realized that these 4 were also members of the Grey Guild Ekantera. Their guildmaster god got mad after Alistar sullied their guild, so he sent his men to torture him and Silk. The Holy Sword apologized for the problem he did not anticipate, but Alistar didn't accept it and called him an idiot scrap metal. He froze when a monkey asked if he was worried about Silk. The monkeys chuckled and said their boss was with her and would destroy that woman's dream. They all laughed at the miserable-looking Alistar. The sword noticed Alistar's face had changed, so he tried to calm him from worrying about Silk, but the sword was wrong. He felt his blood boiling in anger because these bastards were looking down on him. Alistar told the sword to execute them all, but the sword was in disbelief that it was his reason for getting mad. Going back to the theater, Albert sighed and said Elias would take time before getting there. He added that he sent some of his men to slow him down so they could enjoy themselves first. Albert wondered if he would perish before getting there, making Silk speechless. Albert chuckled and said she finally made a lovely, terrified face. He added that it was more exciting than a composed one. Magari figured that this man wasn't a good type of scum, just like from the book. She sighed and said it would be impossible to have a convenient hottie to come save her from the villain. She stood up and was about to leave when she noticed something. Alistar was crawling on the floor quietly. Alistar was surprised to see Magari there. They stared for a moment, and she asked what he was doing in a low voice. Alistar returned the question to her, and she said she was with the prince, and asked what was wrong with all his wounds. Magari noticed the sword he was holding. The holy sword told Alistar to move as Silk's dream depended on them. Magari's eyes widened looking at it. Both of them flinched when Silk suddenly raised her voice and said Elias was strong and wouldn't lose against someone like him. Albert chuckled at her reaction. Alistar dropped his mouth and said Silk made things harder for him. The holy sword was surprised to see Alistar in tears, crying like a kid. He was crying because he had to do scary and painful stuff, so Magari stood up and pointed at the villain. She spoke like an actor and told Gyabari that his evilness would end now. Alistar was dumbfounded, looking at her. When Magari announced that the hero Elias had arrived, he pissed his diaper. Albert squinted his eyes to get a better look. Alistar's eyes were glued at her. He whispered and called her a witch, but Magari found it entertaining. I just love how they freaking betray each other every chance they get. She said Alistar should be the Elias, so the examiner would report the news to the king once he defeated Gyabari with that holy sword. Alistar was speechless after realizing she was doing this to tie him to the capital with her. Magari smirked and chuckled devilishly. Alistar grabbed the sword and bravely told Gyabari that he wouldn't allow him to commit any other evil acts in front of the saintess. It looks like he would be dragging Magari into the act as well. Magari was in total shock as she had not not expected this. Meanwhile, Silk, Albert and the audience were shocked to see the country's saintess. Alistar called Marguerite and said she was the symbol of love and shouldn't run away and save them. Alistar dragged her again to the stage, while mockingly begging her to lend her power to defeat Gyabiri. He faced the villain and wished Marguerite would be a bit more useful. Silk stared at him worriedly, wanting to tell him to be careful. Alistar smiled at her and said he would protect her dream, making Marguerite feel sick as hell. Albert called Elias and figured he had defeated the useless men he sent to slow him down. He smirked and said he did not expect that he would also bring the saintess there. Albert laughed and thanked Elias for letting him enjoy the both of them once he crushed his pretty face. Alistar was surprised that this man wasn't scared of the saintess, so he exclaimed he would be the one beating him. Albert was surprised by his confidence and thought it must be coming from defeating Edwiju. Out of nowhere, he smirked and told him that he liked him. Albert asked him to join his guild and have all the money and women he wanted. Is it just me? Does Albert look like Lapu Lapu? Alistar sternly denied his offer, as he didn't want to be belittled by this scum. The holy sword was having a headache with the scumbags surrounding him. Albert scoffed and removed his vest, making Alistar grossed, wondering if he only wanted to flex his muscles or strip. Albert screamed from his lungs. An immense mana emerged from his body. His muscles were buffed and became rigid. The holy sword said it was a metal magic, making his body tough and heavy as steel. Albert's body was smoking hot. Smoking. Yeah. The sword said with his body getting heavier, his movements would get slower. Albert lifted his head and grinned at Alistar. He smashed his steel fist against each other and challenged Elias, which is Alistar. He swung his fist back and sent it towards him as speedily as lightning. Alistar cursed and asked the sword what part he said its movement was slowed. He was trembling while looking at the spot where he was standing. The floor was cracked, and receiving a blow from Albert would definitely end his life in an instant. Albert swung the other arm, startling Alistar. The holy sword controlled his body to flip and go behind his opponent. Albert saw him and swung his leg towards his direction in midair. Silk called Alistar's name, but luckily, the holy sword blocked it in time. The impact was strong, sending him flying and gliding on the floor. Alistar grunted and huffed for air. Silk gasped and ran to check him. The sword saw the tears in his eyes, so he worriedly asked if he was alright. Alistar said he was in pain and wanted to go home and eat potatoes. The sword said they should try harder and quicker, but his words were cut off when Megari said it was no good. Alistar was surprised and looked at her. Meiji stared at him for a second and said Alistar could not beat that guy fighting like that. He grabbed the sword, dumbfounded by what she was saying. The sword was surprised and asked Meiji if she could hear what he was saying all this time, but Silk was the most clueless person there. Don't leave our Silk hanging, you scumbags. Alistar stared at Magari, waiting for her response. When she sighed and said she could hear him, Alistar was shocked. The sword was confused and said only those who were compatible with him should be able to hear his voice. Alistar side-eyed Silk and wondered if she could also hear him. Magari sat and told him to save those chit-chats for later. She said he didn't have the stamina to continue avoiding Gyaburi's attack, and confidently said yes. She giggled and mockingly said Alistar never held a sword before, so he couldn't keep up those movements, which shocked Silk. Magari said she overheard the sword forcing Alistar's body to move. She added that Alistar's stamina would be drained if the fight goes on like this. Now that she mentioned it, the sword figured that Alistar was in pain the whole time he was forcing his body to move. Silk found him even more kind after knowing he had pushed himself to his limits to protect her. Magari widened her eyes and whispered that he should do it in a single move if he wanted to murder someone. The sword started to get confused about who the villain of this act was. Magari suddenly remembered the power she felt in the forest and asked if it was from the holy sword. He said yes, and Magari told him that using it again would work. Alistar felt sick when she plastered her fake puppy face and told him he could do it, but he could hear her inner voice saying she wanted to leave and sleep now. Alistar stood up and faced Lapu Lapu. What I meant was Albert. He grinned and asked if he was done talking to his coaches. Albert told him to say his final words, making Alistar say to the sword to hit him on a vital spot in one move. The sword told him that they would use the holy slash, but Alistar insulted him for its lame name. Albert chuckled and commented that his stance was full of openings. When he charged forward, Alistar smirked as he could feel the dark aura emerging from the holy sword. He moved the sword a little to show him what he could do when he got serious. The amount of dark magic power from the sword was felt. Those who touched it felt immense fear in an instant, but of course there is an exemption. Magari was feeling the pleasant breeze. Albert could feel the powerful force pushing him. The sword suddenly gasped and asked what was happening. Alistar confusingly looked at him and thought he was using a lame holy slash. The sword said there should be an overflowing divine light, but Alistar asked how he would know, since he had turned into a demon sword. He felt something on his hand, and he gasped when he saw black snakes come out of his hand. He wondered if those gross snakes came from the bruise on his arms. He started whining like a kid, asking the sword what he did to his body. On the other hand, Albert had been having a hard time guessing what this ominous magic power was. He grunted and asked who the hell he was. Alistar frowned his eyebrows and said he was only an ordinary guy fated to be burdened with fighting with this cursed sword. Albert started sweating when he heard it was a cursed sword. Everyone watching felt the intensity, but that witch at the back was sniffing the calming breeze. The sword reminded Alistar that he was a holy sword, but he was ignored and told the demon sword to attack, and screamed, "Evil slash. Albert gasped and tried to block it with his arms, but he could feel his steel skin cracking. When multiple slashes landed on him, he was defeated quickly. Alistar chased his breath and stared at his body, wondering if he ended his life totally. Alistar glared at the sword and said it was his fault, but it said that the sinister energy wasn't his power, but Alistar's. They were relieved when Albert moved and started coughing. Magari went to play her role as a saintess and checked Silk. The sword sighed and said Magari knew him well, and that he didn't have the strength to fight like he had planned. Alistar suddenly thought Magari had known him since they were kids. They were always together, searching for the other's weaknesses. Alistar sighed and said she always pointlessly observed him. The sword wiggled and said Magari stayed beside him despite knowing he was a scum, and even helped him earlier. The sword blushed and said Magari loved him so much. Alistar was speechless, flashing his surprisingly disgusted face, as did Magari. Of course, because she heard you, holy sword. Alistar and Magari might be a match made in hell though. Alistar started flapping the sword rapidly, and asked what he did to make that snake come out of him. He stopped when he heard Silk's voice. He was stunned when Silk jumped at him and hugged his face. Alistar was screaming, drowning below those melons. Silk hugged him tightly, and apologized for making him do things for her. Alistar tilted his face to the side to breathe, and felt gross after feeling other people's body heat. Silk looked at him and said he was being forced to move by the demon's sword, but he told her not to worry about it. Silk felt emotional, and hugged him again. Magari felt his stomach rumbling. Somebody gave this witch a bucket. Silk wiped her tears and humbly thanked Alistar. The examiner ran to her and asked for a moment. They were amazed by her marvelous acting skills. Alistar couldn't believe that these people thought they were acting when he almost died earlier. The examiner asked Silk to join the Royal Theatre troupe, making Alistar think that after Silk joined the theater, she could introduce a rich woman to leech off. So he shook her hand and congratulated Silk. He said her dreams had come true and she could become a famous actress now. Silk was flustered for a moment. She smiled and said she was grateful for Alistar's help. Magari stared at the demon's sword and called his name. The sword started to get nervous by her smile. Alistar felt his sword trembling and asked what was the problem. The sword said he suddenly got a chill from someone. From the seats, the prince was there. He was speechless by what he had witnessed. The following morning, Alistar was with Helge. The knight apologized for having him come to the castle this early. Alistar said it was alright, since he felt guilty for staying there without working, but he was actually crying in pain last night. The sword suddenly asked why the king called for him, and Alistar replied, saying the king must be suggesting how to get rid of him. Alistar chuckled and said everyone saw how wicked the demon sword's power was, and bid farewell to him mockingly. He added that the sword would get sealed again, and be alone for hundreds of years. He jumped when a familiar, terrifying voice called him. Magari came running to him, asking how his wounds were. He waved at her and said he was alright. The sword commended them for acting innocent, really good. Magari's name was called from the corridor, and it was Prince Iria, with a not happy face. He told the saintess not to go alone wandering around the castle. He grabbed her hand and charmingly said she could call him whenever she wanted to go out to protect her. Magari couldn't believe her happiness of meeting her childhood friend vanished that quickly. The prince glared at Alistar when he heard Alistar was her childhood friend. Alistar greeted the prince and thanked him for being kind to his childhood friend Magari. He looked at Magari and gave her a look, saying she would never get out of the castle once he became the prince's bride. But the prince did not like Alistar's gaze. Prince Ira grabbed her waist closer and told Alistar not to talk to him so familiarly. Alistar apologized and told the demon sword to use the full power of the evil slash on this bastard. Alistar's boiling point was too low after knowing the prince was looking down on his unique existence. The prince told Magari they should go first, but she sent a message through her eyes. She wished him good luck, sending shivers down his spine. Helge told him they should also go now, because the king had been waiting for him. Once they got inside and greeted each other, the king said he would entrust the holy sword to him. Alistar was speechless. It was something he did not expect to happen. Magari was chuckling as everything was going as she had planned. The king had announced that Alistar was chosen as the holy sword user. Prince Iria couldn't believe his father would entrust a country's treasure to a peasant. Alistar glared at him and ordered the sword to execute the prince. The king said the legendary sword could only be wielded by the person compatible with it. He called Helge and ordered him to try to hold the holy sword. Without knowing what would happen, Alistar gave it to the knight, and when Helge touched it, a surge of dark magic power paralyzed him. Alistar immediately pulled it in shock. Alistar glared at the sword and asked how he did it, but even the sword was clueless about what happened. The sword couldn't believe he had attacked somebody without a reason, and started doubting his own identity. The king said he had expected a more ominous appearance than he heard in the legends. He added that he had heard from the saintess that he had mastered the sword's ominous magic power. Alistar was about to deny it, but Magari butted in and said it was all true. She exclaimed that her childhood friend had mastered it, and even saved her and everyone at the theater. She added that Alistar's strong heart could turn that ominous strength to its original holy state. Alistar facepalmed as if he could not take any more from this witchy woman's acting. He tried to talk again to deny it, but the king stopped him. He was told that he would stay in the capital and serve the country for peace. Magari was chuckling devilishly upon seeing his defeated, sulking face. Alistar bowed and obeyed the king. He sighed and cheered himself, saying he would get to live in a high-class inn. The king suddenly asked the hero, Alistar, to act as Saintess Magari's guard guard on her way to a pilgrimage at the mermaid village. Magari gasped softly and smiled at Alistar, saying she would be in his care. The day came when the couple from Hell would go on a trip to the mermaid village. The village was strangely quiet because most of the mermaids were tied to the land. A group of men took out a bag of gold and jewelry. They placed the compensation on the ground and said they couldn't believe she would be selling off her own kin. The mermaid behind this chuckled and said all she wanted was money, jewels, art, and the rumor she had recently heard, the holy sword. I'm willing to bet our scumbag protagonist would try to sell the sword to the mermaid. Alistair had been chasing his breath from all the walks they had taken. The sword asked if he was alright, because he looked like his head was about to fall off. Alistair said he would throw him away because he was too heavy, making the sword nervous. He thought the sea was too far away, that there was no way he could do it all on foot. The sword sighed and told him he should have accepted the horse Helge was lending to him. Alistair said he had never touched a horse on the farm, much less ridden one, because he always skipped work. He argued with the sword, but suddenly heard an irritating high-pitched voice. Magari waved at him, telling him not to force himself, and asked him to hop on, but her eyes told the opposite. Alistair composed himself, and said it was nothing compared to all the farm work he did. He smiled and told her to make sure not to throw up, since it was her first time in a carriage. The knights watched them in envy, making the sword realize these two scumbags acting made them more favorable to others. They continued to cheer and say kind lines to themselves, in an angry tone secretly. When they had arrived, the breeze from the sea welcomed them. The villagers came out once they heard the clucking sound of the horseshoe. The sword praised him for making it alive to the village, but Alistair shut him up and said he only made things difficult because of his weight. A woman came to them to greet and welcome them to their village. Some of the villagers went to them to meet the visitors. Magari smiled, with her hands clasped together, and blessed them with her face card. Alistair watched her acting from the back, and assumed Magari was thinking about insulting the village's plain appearance. The woman said there was nothing in the town, but they would be lucky if they spotted a mermaid. Magari was surprised that the mermaid's existence was true. The woman said the mermaids were said to be very beautiful. Magari said she would love to meet one during their stay, but the woman warned them about the song. She explained that the mermaids do have beautiful appearances, but their voices are even more beautiful. Magari asked about the song. The woman said when a villager didn't return, it was said that a mermaid charmed them with their song and dragged them to the bottom of the sea. The two scumbags started to worry because they thought someone beautiful like them would be at the most risk. These two never fail to lift their own chairs. The woman chuckled and said it was only legends and rumors. She said they had prepared some food at the inn, and once they were done eating, they all went to their own respective rooms. Alistair was annoyed by how the inn was looking. The sword told him to be grateful because the knights were camping out, which he did not care about. Alistair said those knights' muscles would probably protect them against the cold. He lay on his bed and was about to fall asleep when he heard a song. He cursed the noise and slammed the window. He marched back to his bed and slid inside his blanket, but the sword kept bugging him, so he heard a girl's voice. Alistair took the pillow back and told him to shut up. The sword said it would be wrong if something like the time with Silk happened again, but Alistair smacked him with the pillow and said Silk was only practicing her lines. The sword pulled him and said, this time, it might be different. Alistair tried to shove him away and call him a lump of dirty rust, but the sword did not stop. When Alistair felt his nose rounder and bigger, he stood up and said he would go now. He went outside in the middle of the night. He wandered around, but everything seemed peaceful. He sighed and told the sword they should head back now, but a song was heard from the ocean right on time. He gasped and remembered what the villager had told them earlier about the singing voice. He tried to run away, but the sword pulled him. The sword pointed in a direction, and there he saw a girl singing under the moonlight. Doesn't this feel nostalgic? Silk was also under the moonlight when he saw her. They thought the girl seemed normal, except for that bust size for her age. He looked around and didn't notice anything strange, so he tried to drag the sword back, but the sword was fighting him. Alistair called the sword a moron, because he would only bring trouble to him. The sword was dragging him as he said being alone at night was dangerous. The mermaid heard something moving, and was shocked to see a man behind the bush. Alistair had a better view of her melons. What I meant was her face. Her hair was short, was wearing a star necklace. The mermaid got nervous and stared at him for a moment, but when Alistair noticed a fishtail behind the girl, he started sweating. The two screamed loudly like they saw a ghost in lingerie. Magari spotted a shooting star, so she grabbed this chance and wished for something bothersome to befall Alistair. As expected of the saintess, the mermaid inquired what a human desired with him, her voice trembling with the fear that Alistair had come to abduct her. Alistair countered that such was not his intention. The mermaid persisted, asserting that he clearly planned to perform lewd acts upon her. Alistair denied the accusation, questioning what he could possibly want with a mere fish. He proceeded to calm the creature, introducing himself and explaining that his presence was sparked by concern when he heard a girl's voice and felt compelled to investigate. He emphasized that he harbored no malicious intent and hoped his presence would no longer alarm her. The mermaid frowned, remaining unconvinced by his explanation. Consequently, he noted the rumor that mermaids often lured unsuspecting humans into the depths of the sea. The mermaid questioned whether he was referring to instances where humans suffered accidents of their own volition, mesmerized by their music, only to shift the blame onto the mermaids. Alistair responded with a smile. However, internally, he harbored a desire to transform the mermaid into sashimi. He offered an apology. Upon hearing the mention of sashimi, Suddenly, his sword inquired what he intended to do, to which Alistar commanded the weapon to remain silent, remarking that nobody would notice if a single fish vanished. The mermaid remained skeptical that Alistar would have found her, convinced that no one would venture into such a place at night, especially not someone as odd as he. Alistar stepped closer, observing that mermaids were rumored to rarely reveal themselves to humanity. She remarked that, according to lore, should a human discover them, they would inevitably be captured and sold. This revelation stunned Alistar, who struggled to comprehend such human cruelty. She continued, noting that many mermaids had recently disappeared, leading to widespread speculation that humans were harvesting them for slave markets. Alistar felt a jolt of shock at this news. He warned the mermaid to exercise caution, and prepared to return to the inn. The sword urged him to inquire why she remained out there in isolation, suggesting she might be saved, a matter the sword claimed was unrelated to him, while also expressing concern over the disappearing mermaids. Alistar grew irritated, perceiving the situation as a mere nuisance. He pondered the consequences should this escalate like the Silk incident. If so, they would be compelled to intervene. Alistar gritted his teeth, recalling the profound suffering, injuries, and the mysterious scar on his arm he had endured previously. The mermaid watched him, confused by his behavior. He explained that regardless of her species, it remained dangerous for a girl to wander alone at night. This prompted a flush to rise to the mermaid's cheeks. She admitted she had come to practice her singing. She remarked that mermaids were naturally gifted vocalists from birth, though she lacked the proficiency of her peers and therefore practiced in secrecy, hoping to emulate her older sister. Alistar flinched, asking if she indeed possessed an older sibling. Alistar inwardly lamented his inability to empathize with her, maintaining his belief that his own magnificence was peerless. The cursed sword questioned the source of such baseless confidence. The mermaid shouted that if he expected her to be swayed by such thoughts, he would be disappointed. She clutched her chest, accusing Alistar of attempting to seduce her with platitudes to facilitate her eventual kidnapping. Alistar denied the charge, while his dark thoughts urged him to sell her to a slaver. The mermaid suddenly erupted into laughter, claiming she was merely jesting, noting it had been a long time since she had laughed so heartily, and declared Alistar a good man. The sword grumbled that this scummy individual was merely viewing her as a fish. Alistar snapped at the weapon to be quiet, blaming it for their prolonged conversation with her. Subsequently, the mermaid requested a favor, explaining that she lacked friends and often hindered her sister, which prevented her from bonding with other mermaids. A bad feeling washed over Alistar. When she asked him to be her friend, he inadvertently voiced his internal monologue, remarking that the situation sounded dreadful. The mermaid appeared shattered, and Alistar began to tremble, uncertain how to justify his words. As the mermaid began to weep, Alistar recalled that mermaid tears turned into jewels. He found this prospect marvelous, and considered provoking her further. The sword chastised him for being the worst, threatening that if his current form did not bring repentance, it would escalate the punishment. Alistar was suddenly struck by a severe headache, which the sword attributed to his transgressions. He quickly clarified that he did not mean friendship with her was awful, but rather that the loneliness she described was tragic. He then asked if they were already friends. The mermaid, shocked, wondered why he was feigning such composure. Alistar cursed her internally, labeling her as sashimi. She expressed her joy, affirming her desire to be his friend. Alistar, clutching his throbbing head, commanded the sword to cease the pain, reassuring the mermaid that they were indeed friends. The sword agreed to provide relief. The mermaid identified herself as Noel Pilati, expressing her happiness at meeting him. Alistar, however, internally rejected the encounter, convinced they would never cross paths again. Morning arrived, and the sword roused the sleeping Alistar. He resisted, remaining in bed, yawning and threatening to shatter the sword if it did not remain silent. He rose, complaining that he felt unrested, citing the burden of his heavy gear and the nocturnal encounter with a monster. The sword countered that he was perpetually abusive. A commotion outside caught his attention, and the sword urged him to investigate. Alistar massaged his temples, glaring at the weapon due to his exhaustion, yet the sword insisted they go out, regardless of his visible disdain. Outside, a crowd had gathered. Alistar questioned the cause of the assembly and spotted Magari, inquiring about the situation. She informed him that a mermaid had arrived in the village. A girl stepped forward, introducing herself as a mermaid named Pamela Pilati, and offered a cheerful greeting. Alistar blinked, questioning how a mermaid could possess feet. Magari explained that, according to her books, mermaids were capable of assuming human form. Pamela noted that they had heard of the priestess's arrival and had come to offer a formal greeting. Alistar abruptly seized Magari's shoulder, staring mockingly into her eyes, and shouted that the priestess was standing right beside him. Helge instructed Magari to move to the front, while Alistar continued to taunt her for her previous desire to encounter a mermaid. Suddenly, Pamela announced her intention to greet both the priestess and the hero of the Holy Sword. This declaration left Alistar completely stunned. Pamela proposed guiding the pair to Mermaid Island, and extended an invitation to accompany her. Both Alistar and Magari reacted with astonishment, exchanging a wary glance. Suddenly, Alistar collapsed to his knees in apparent agony, startling Magari. When Pamela inquired about his condition, he apologized, attributing the sudden malaise to the sword he carried. He asserted that the weapon possessed immense magical power, yet demanded a grueling, constant toll from its wielder. He claimed a surge of recoil had just struck him, rendering him unable to undertake the journey in his current state. Behind him, Magari silently observed that he feigned the illness with expert precision. Alistar whispered to the sword, remarking on the true burden it imposed, though the weapon countered that the blame lay with him for turning its essence pitch black. He then looked toward Magari, insisting he would recover and urging her to proceed without him. This caught Magari off guard, but Helge stepped forward, offering to act as her escort, a gesture that drew a smile from Magari. Alistar concluded that the simple-minded knight was clearly infatuated with her. Helge vowed to protect Magari at all costs. Alistar offered a smile to Magari, remarking that he felt relieved by Helge's presence and believed there was nothing to fear. Although Pamela appeared pleased to escort Magari, she persisted in requesting that Alistar join them. She thanked the group for the meeting and offered a song as a token of gratitude. As she began to perform, the audience became captivated by the melody. The cursed sword warned Alistar that the song signaled danger. Alistar questioned the nature of such a grotesque composition, and Magari similarly remarked that it sounded repulsive. The sword noted their lack of susceptibility, explaining that the song utilized powerful charm magic designed to instill obsessive love and facilitate mental control. While Magari's status as a saintess might explain her immunity, the sword found it unusual that a common peasant like Alistar remained unaffected, surmising that perhaps his natural resistance to magic was exceptionally high. Once Pamela concluded her performance, she called out to Alistar, renewing her invitation and asking him to be her friend. Alistar declined, leaving Pamela momentarily stunned with her jaw agape. He insisted that he felt genuinely unwell and must refrain. Pamela seemed puzzled as to why her enchantment had failed. The sword marveled at Alistar's resilience, theorizing that because he had already squandered fortunes on horses, mansions, and a life of indulgence, he remained unmoved by material distractions, concluding that such charms simply did not function on someone as depraved as Alistar. The sword questioned why Pamela would resort to charm magic to secure his company, suggesting they abandon the matter since he remained unaffected. However, the sword noted the shared surname between Pamela and Noel, sensing a malevolent aura. Alistar, meanwhile, sensed only trouble. Magari then addressed Pamela, stating that it appeared Alistar would be joining them after all. Alistar was caught off guard by this declaration. Pamela expressed her delight, while Magari wore a mischievous expression, asserting that she would not allow him to escape alone regardless of his efforts. She added that she intended to watch with amusement as he was dragged into further complications. Alistar buried his face in his hands, mentally cursing Magari. Pamela, now clad in a bikini, announced that she would use her magic to transport them to Mermaid Island. As they watched her transform into a mermaid, the pair felt a sense of wonder, with Alistar musing that turning such a spectacle into a show could prove highly profitable, while Magari pondered the veracity of the legend that consuming mermaid flesh granted immortality. Pamela conjured a massive bubble and instructed them to enter. Once they were submerged deep beneath the waves, surrounded by a myriad of fish, Magari questioned him regarding the identity of Noel. Alistar explained that she was a mermaid he had encountered the previous night. Having noted the shared surname of Noel Pilati, he surmised that Pamela was her older sister. The sword questioned why an older sister would employ charm magic against Alistar and the villagers. Magari teased him for his penchant for secret nocturnal meetings with girls, admitting she found it difficult to contain her laughter at his predicament. Irritated, Alistar branded her a derogatory name, demanding she cease clinging to him because he lacked the ability to swim. Pamela observed their physical proximity and commented on it. Magari declared that they were childhood friends. All the while, Pamela kept her gaze fixed on Alistar, internalizing her confusion over why her charm magic had failed to take hold. She wondered why such a potent spell would falter against a hero, eventually attributing his resistance to the formidable power of the holy sword. A smile spread across her face as she decided the weapon would be hers, a treasure that no amount of money could purchase, which she vowed to obtain at any cost. She finally concluded her observation by questioning why the holy sword possessed such a sinister hue. Chapters end at 12. Thank you for watching, guys. I hope you love this manga. Have a good day.